There is a specific type of silence that only exists on a nearly empty train at 2 in the morning. A heavy and metallic quiet that makes every shift of the carriage feel like a personal intrusion. For the last 3 nights, I have sat in the exact same seat in the third car, leaning my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of the window while the city lights blurred into long streaks of neon yellow and dying red. I thought I was alone, or at least as alone as one can be in a public space, until I noticed the reflection in the dark pane of glass directly across from me. It wasn't a ghost or a trick of the light, but the steady, unblinking image of a man sitting 3 rows back, his body perfectly still while his eyes remained fixed on the back of my skull. He didn't have a book, he wasn't looking at a phone, and he didn't seem to be waiting for a stop. He was simply existing in that space as a shadow that had finally decided to take a human shape. The first night I saw him, I dismissed it as the typical strangeness of late-night travel, telling myself that perhaps he was just tired or lost in his own thoughts. But when I saw him again on the second night, sitting in the same spot and wearing the same dull, gray windbreaker, a cold knot began to tighten in the center of my chest. Now, on the third night, the coincidence has curdled into a terrifying certainty that I am being hunted by someone who understands my routine better than I do. I can feel the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against my neck, a heavy warmth that makes the hair on my arms stand up despite the air conditioning blowing directly onto my skin. I find myself wondering if he knows where I live, or if he is simply waiting for the moment I step off this train and into the poorly lit streets of my neighborhood. How long has he been watching me from the darkness of the platform before I even board the train each night? As the train begins to slow down for my stop, the screeching of the metal brakes sounds like a scream that I am too afraid to let out myself. I look at the reflection one last time and my heart stops when I see him slowly stand up. His movements fluid and deliberate, as if he has practiced this moment 1,000 times in his head. He doesn't reach for a bag and he doesn't look toward the door. He simply stands there, staring at my reflection with a face that is completely devoid of emotion or intent. The doors hiss open with a sound that feels final, like the closing of a tomb, and I step out onto the concrete platform with my legs feeling like they are made of lead. I don't look back, but I can hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots hitting the ground a few yards behind me, matching my pace perfectly as if we are connected by an invisible thread. The station is a cavern of yellow light and deep shadows, and every corner seems to hide a new threat as I hurry toward the exit stairs. Why is no one else here tonight? And why does the air feel so thick that I can barely pull it into my lungs? I reach the street level and the cool night air hits my face, but it brings no relief because the streetlights are flickering, casting long, dancing shadows that make it impossible to tell where the sidewalk ends and the darkness begins. I turn the corner toward my apartment complex, my keys already clenched in my fist like a makeshift weapon, but the sound of his footsteps doesn't fade. In fact, they seem to be getting louder, faster, as if he is tired of the game and is ready to close the distance between us once and for all. I decide to take a risk and duck into the narrow alleyway that serves as a shortcut to the back entrance of my building, a place I usually avoid after dark because of the broken lights and the piles of discarded crates. My breath is coming in ragged gasps now, and I can feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, giving me a sudden burst of clarity amidst the fog of my terror. I see a large industrial trash bin and I slide behind it, pressing my back against the damp brick wall and trying to silence the sound of my own heart, which feels loud enough to echo off the buildings. I wait, frozen in the dark, watching the entrance of the alleyway with wide, stinging eyes. A moment later, his shadow stretches across the pavement, long and distorted like a monster from a nightmare. He stops at the mouth of the alley, his head tilting to the side as he listens for the sound of my footsteps. The silence is absolute, broken only by the distant hum of a siren and the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere above us. He takes a step forward, then another, his presence filling the narrow space with a sense of impending violence that makes my stomach churn. He is so close now that I can smell the faint, metallic scent of his jacket and the stale aroma of cheap cigarettes. He reaches into his pocket, and for a second, I am sure this is how it ends, in a dark corner of a city that doesn't care if I live or die. But then, The sound of a heavy door opening and the bright beam of a flashlight cuts through the darkness from the other end of the alley. It's the night security guard from the warehouse next door, doing his rounds with a large, barking German shepherd on a short leash. The man in the gray windbreaker freezes, his silhouette illuminated for a split second before he turns on his heel and vanishes back toward the main street with a speed that is truly unsettling. I stay hidden for a long time, even after the guard has passed and the alley is quiet again, waiting to make sure the dark passenger is truly gone. When I finally make it inside my apartment and lock the 3 deadbolts on my door, I realize that I am safe for now, but the reflection of those unblinking eyes will stay with me every time I close my eyes to sleep. The raindrops were hitting my windshield with the rhythmic intensity of 1,000 tiny fingers tapping on glass, creating a distorted wall of water that made the streetlights of the city look like bleeding smears of orange ink. It was nearly 3 in the morning, the graveyard shift of the rideshare world, where the streets belong to the exhausted, the desperate, and the people who don't want to be found. I was ready to pull over and call it a night when the notification chirped on my dashboard, a request from a user named "Be located just 2 blocks away in a darkened industrial district." I should have ignored it. I should have listened to the cold instinct rising in my throat, but the surge pricing was high and the promise of a final paycheck pushed me to turn the steering wheel into the shadows. When I pulled up to the curb, there was no one there at first, just a row of boarded-up warehouses and a single flickering streetlight that seemed to be gasping for air. Then, out of the darkness of a recessed doorway, a figure emerged, wearing a heavy black coat with the hood pulled so low that his face was nothing more than a void of shadow. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check the license plate. He simply opened the back door and slid inside, bringing with him a sudden, freezing draft and the sharp, metallic scent of wet pavement and something else I couldn't quite name. I watched him in my rearview mirror, waiting for a greeting or a destination confirmation. But he sat perfectly still, his gloved hands resting flat on his knees like a mannequin waiting to be activated. "Heading to 442 Willow Creek Road?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and fragile against the heavy drumming of the rain on the roof. He didn't look up. He didn't nod. He simply whispered a yes. That was so low it felt more like a vibration in the air than an actual human sound. As I pulled away from the curb, I realized with a sudden jolt of electricity down my spine that Willow Creek Road didn't exist in this part of the county, or at least it hadn't been on any map I had ever studied in my 3 years of driving these streets. I glanced at my GPS, but the screen was strangely blank, showing only a blue dot pulsing in the middle of a gray vacuum as if we had already driven off the edge of the known world. The silence in the car became a physical weight, a thick blanket that made it hard to turn my head or even check the mirrors without feeling like I was moving through molasses. We drove deeper into the outskirts of the city, moving away from the safety of the neon signs and into the rural patches where the trees grew thick and leaned over the road like skeletal ribcages. "You're a long way from home, David." The voice came from the back seat, cutting through the quiet like a jagged blade. My heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer against my ribs with a violence that made my vision blur at the edges. I hadn't told him my name, and my driver profile only listed me as Dave. Yet he had used the full name my mother used to call me when I was a child. "How do you know my name?" I managed to choke out, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought the plastic might snap in my hands. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he leaned forward just enough for the dim light of the dashboard to catch the edge of a pale, scarred chin. "Your daughter, Sarah. She still sleeps with the night light on because she's afraid of the closet door being cracked open. Isn't that right?" He whispered, his tone conversational and terrifyingly intimate. The world outside the car seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us in this metal box, hurtling through the dark toward a destination that was starting to feel like a grave. I realized then that this wasn't a random fare. This was a predator who had been studying the architecture of my life from the darkness of the sidelines for a very long time. He began to recite more details, the color of my front door, the dent in my wife's bumper, the exact time I usually get home, and the way I always check the mailbox before going inside. Each word was a threat, a silent promise that he had already invaded my sanctuary and was now simply playing with his food before the final strike. I looked at the door locks, wondering if I should jump out at the next turn, but we were going 60 miles per hour down a narrow lane with no shoulder and no escape. The GPS suddenly flickered to life, directing me to turn onto a dirt path that led toward a collapsed bridge over a black, rushing river. "This is it, David. This is where we get out," he said, and I heard the unmistakable, heavy click of a folding knife being snapped into place in the darkness of the back seat. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to turn the hunter into the prey before the car came to a final stop. I saw the blue and red lights of a roadside assistance van parked near a construction barrier about half a mile ahead, the only sign of life in this desolate stretch of woods. I didn't slow down, I didn't signal. I simply slammed my foot onto the brake with every ounce of strength I possessed while simultaneously jerking the wheel toward the construction pylons. The car fishtailed wildly, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt as we spun in a sickening circle of metal and rain. The sudden centrifugal force threw the passenger against the door, his head hitting the window with a dull thud that sounded like a heavy stone hitting the earth. Before he could recover or find his footing, I fumbled for the door handle and rolled out into the mud, the cold water soaking into my clothes instantly as I scrambled toward the lights of the work van. I screamed for help, my voice cracking with the sheer terror of the last 20 minutes, and I saw the construction worker jump out of his cab with a heavy wrench in his hand. I turned back to look at my car, expecting to see the man in the black coat emerging from the wreckage like a shadow, but the back door was swinging open and the interior was empty. He had vanished into the woods as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind only a small, damp photograph sitting on the back seat. When the police arrived and I finally gathered the courage to look at it, I saw it was a picture of me, taken through my own living room window just 3 nights ago. I was safe for now, but as I sat in the back of the patrol car, I knew that the dark passenger was still out there in the rain, waiting for the next ride. The hum of the industrial cooling fans is the only heartbeat this building has after midnight, a low and constant drone that vibrates through the soles of my boots and into my very bones. I have worked the graveyard shift at the logistics center for 3 years, moving through the labyrinth of towering metal shelves where the shadows are thick enough to swallow a person whole without leaving a single trace. It is a lonely existence, punctuated only by the occasional beep of a forklift in the distance or the rhythmic clatter of the conveyor belts as they carry nameless boxes into the dark. I used to find the solitude peaceful, a sanctuary from the noise of the daylight world, until the gifts started appearing at my workstation exactly 1 hour before my shift was scheduled to end. The first gift was a simple paper cup of black coffee, still steaming in the chilled air of the loading dock, placed right next to my logbook while I was away performing a perimeter check. I assumed it was a gesture of kindness from a coworker, perhaps one of the drivers who had arrived early for a morning pickup, but when I asked around, no one claimed to have been near my station. The second gift arrived 2 nights later, a small silver key on a frayed blue ribbon that I recognized with a jolt of ice in my chest as the spare key to my own front door. I had lost that key 3 months ago in a park 5 miles away from this warehouse, and seeing it lying there under the harsh fluorescent lights made the air in the room feel suddenly thin and suffocating. I began to feel a presence following me through the aisles, a dark passenger who moved through the blind spots of the security cameras with a terrifying precision. I would turn a corner and catch the faint rustle of a heavy jacket or the sound of a single footstep echoing just a second after my own had stopped. The psychological pressure was building like steam in a sealed pipe, a constant state of high alert that made every shadow look like a crouching figure waiting to spring. Tonight, the air feels different, heavier, and more stagnant, as if the building itself is holding its breath in anticipation of a confrontation that I am not prepared to have. I walked into the break room to grab my jacket, and there, taped to the inside of my locker, was the most terrifying gift of all. It was a stack of 3 Polaroid photographs, the chemical smell of the developing film still sharp and stinging in the small room. The first photo was of me standing at the automated teller machine 2 blocks from my house. The second was of me eating dinner alone in my kitchen, and the third was a close-up of my own face while I was asleep in my bed. The realization that someone had been inside my home, standing over me while I was at my most vulnerable, sent a wave of nausea through my stomach that made me lean against the cold metal lockers for support. The lights in the break room suddenly flickered and died, plunging the space into a thick, velvety darkness that seemed to press against my eyes. I heard the heavy fire door at the end of the hallway creak open, followed by the slow, deliberate scrape of a metal tool being dragged across the concrete floor. The sound was steady, a rhythmic countdown that told me he was no longer interested in hiding or leaving cryptic messages. He was coming for me now, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who owned the space more than I ever did. I didn't have a weapon, and my phone was sitting on the charging dock back at my station, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. I had to rely on my knowledge of the warehouse, the secret geography of the narrow maintenance tunnels, and the hidden service ladders that led to the roof. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling silently across the linoleum floor and into the main warehouse floor, where the rows of shelving units stretched out like a graveyard of giants. I could hear him behind me, his breathing heavy and wet, a sound that told me he was exerting himself, enjoying the hunt with a predatory glee. I reached the base of a high-density racking system and began to climb the metal frame, my fingers slipping on the cold steel as I pulled myself upward toward the catwalks 40 feet above the floor. I could see him now, a dark silhouette standing in the center of the aisle, holding a long, heavy crowbar that caught the faint glint of the emergency exit lights. He stopped at the foot of the rack I was on, his head tilting upward as he sniffed the air like an animal tracking a scent. "I know you're up there, Michael. I can hear your heart jumping in your chest like a bird in a cage," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to fill the entire cavernous space. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I simply reached out and grabbed a heavy crate of industrial fasteners that was sitting precariously on the edge of the top shelf. As he began to put his hand on the ladder to follow me, I put every ounce of my fear and desperation into a single shove, sending the heavy crate tumbling down toward the concrete floor. The sound of the impact was deafening, a localized explosion of wood and metal that echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. The man screamed as the weight of the crate caught his leg, pinning him to the floor and sending the crowbar skittering across the dark aisle. I didn't wait to see if he could get up. I scrambled across the catwalk and dropped down onto the conveyor belt system, sliding down the rubber ramps and sprinting toward the main security gate. I burst through the doors and into the parking lot, screaming for the night guard who was stationed in the booth at the edge of the property. Within minutes, the police were swarming the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness that had nearly become my shroud. They found him trapped under the crate, a man who had worked as a temp in the mailroom a year ago, someone I had never even spoken to. He was safe behind bars, but every time I hear a floorboard creak in my house or a fan hum in a quiet room, I am reminded that the dark passenger is never really gone. They are just waiting for the next long shift to begin.